I just wanna have peace. Pay for the bill, let them take my car, never see the receipt. Good health, we prize, but everybody around prosperity.
What's up, guys, and welcome to the LivBtr podcast. This is your host, Jay Siano, and this is the show for people trying to optimize every area of their life. Let's go.
I just wanna have peace.
On today's episode of the LivBtr podcast, we have Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal, who's an expert in all things resilience. Her new book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, has been an amazing tool for me to learn, and I look forward to discussing this with her. Welcome to the LivBtr podcast.
Hello, I am so excited to live better today. Let's do it. Let's go.
Today and every day, right?
Today and every day. Why not? Why
Amazing.
not us?
Why not us? Well, listen, you're everything I know about you revolves around a single word that I overuse. I am absolutely obsessed with this word, and it's resilience. And
that's amazing.
It's an amazing word. It really, I think it's the backbone of so many things in life. And I think it's at the top of my list when I think about success and when I think about just all the things, right? So I want to talk about resilience stories. I love your work, and I cannot wait to dive into this. Can you tell us all a little bit more about the work that you're doing with resilience and sharing stories?
Yeah, totally. I want to do that. And I'm going to do something that you probably weren't planning on, which is I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that, because I feel like people are in two camps today. I feel like people are either in the first camp, which is like resilience, really. Are we still talking about this? I am so tired of resilience, right? And what I get to teach the people that are in that camp, and some of our listeners are camping out in that camp today, is that resilience is actually like not the thing that's making us feel exhausted or worn out or burned out. It's actually the cure. You know, it's the large scale challenge, change, and complexity that we're experiencing to a greater extent, really for many of us than we have in our lifetimes, that is so exhausting. And resilience is actually the cure for that, not the cause. And so we're going to talk about how we can harness and amplify resilience today. So some people are coming in with some resilience dread, and I want to acknowledge that. And it's going to be great for you. And then we've got other people in another camp, which is like your camp, Jay, which is like, I love resilience. I'm super interested in it. I want to optimize my life. I talk about this all the time, if not overuse it. So would you tell us a little bit more about like, how is that showing up in your life, and what's got you so excited about resilience?
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and I'm happy to. And, you know, I think that there's whether or not the term, like I said, is overused, right? I think some people have that feeling because they hear it all the time, and it's just being blurted out. But for me, you know, I think I've had some challenges in my life, some trauma in my life, like most people, and everybody else has a different story. But, you know, for me, shortly after college, I lost my mother to cancer. And it was at a very kind of, you know, pivotal moment in life where I kind of thought I had everything figured out and that I was going to do a whole bunch of different things that were already set up for me in life. And the minute that she passed, my entire world changed overnight. My father left from New York to Florida, got remarried shortly thereafter, and I started to have panic attacks. I, for the first time ever, started dealing with really bad anxiety. And this is somebody, you know, who was confident and, again, just felt like they had everything going for themselves. To have that all ripped away. And you know, from there, I kind of had to figure out how to just put the pieces back together, which seemed really, really challenging at the time. Now, obviously, several decades ago. And then from there, you know, I'm a entrepreneur. I started my own company in a very challenging industry, commercial real estate. And in New York, probably one of the most difficult markets to be successful at commercial real estate. And I represent today a lot of founders of major companies that are, you know, commonly known. And I'm always looking at, you know, what makes these people so successful? Like, how does this individual get up every day, kick ass, and, you know, get to the level that they're at? And the absolutely overwhelming reason that every person that I know that's at the highest level of success is resilience, because they get punched in the face all day, every day, and they just get back up and come back after it for more. And that is why I think resilience is the most important thing in life, because if you don't pick yourself back up to fight another day, you are never going to be successful. And that translates not only in career, but in family, in anything. So I said a lot there, but there you have it.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing your story. Many of your listeners might be familiar with your story. I was not familiar with that story and your background. So I'm so delighted to learn more about you and to have you share at that deeper level. And also just like I was listening to everything that you were saying, and I was in such awe of the journey that you have been on for the last 23 years. We all think we have everything figured out at 16, 18, 22 when we graduate from university, until we find out that the more we know, the less we actually know. The more we
Yeah.
learn, the less we know. And to have such an important person, your mother, and to lose her at that time where you're launched from your home and you're like in the United States, you're like going out to make your way in the world. And I think what I didn't realize, and what many people don't realize, is like we have so much more development to do in even our 20s when we're technically an adult. And so to lose a parent at any time, but to lose a parent at that time where your world is shifting and changing and you're just launching out on your own for the first time, and then to lose the security of having one of the most important people in your life pass away is, incredibly traumatic and deeply disorienting.
Yes, it is. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that I'm not still mad about that every single day. And it really is, a big part of the fire burning inside me, to be quote unquote successful. And then in addition to that, to be an amazing father, to be a great leader. And I've realized it really at 40 years old that I was using that loss as an excuse. Like it was a little bit of a crutch for me. Right when it happened, I turned to alcohol. It got very dark for me. I was drinking from my teens, but I was drinking to forget and numb myself, after the loss of my mother. And it took me, and I'm in the scene in New York, and I was a DJ and club promoter before getting into my industry. So I've always had amazing access to great parties and distractions and all the things. And, it dawned on me when I turned 40 that partying was really an excuse for me, and a way for me not to really deal with those things and not to, sit with myself. And it's also why I became a workaholic, shortly after losing my mother. So, those two things distracted me really well for some time. And then, at 40, I decided to clean up my act and, try to become the best possible version of myself. And that's been a 7-year journey, actually 6-year journey, but soon to be 7-year journey. And, I think without realizing those things, we cannot really achieve or unlock, certain levels of greatness. And sobriety for me has been the biggest blessing in my life.
That's powerful too. Look, I think we've all gone on a journey where, and some of us to a greater extent than others, it's all relative, where we sort of go around the dark side of the moon.
Yeah.
We go to the dark side, not like we become the dark side or something, but I think everyone in life has been in the dark place, for an extended period of time, however you want to define that. And, some of us have made that orbit multiple times. And it's not if you go there, it's when. And
Right.
and then it's, not everyone comes back. And so I think so often we can feel ashamed or shameful or embarrassed of kind of, those darker moments in our lives, the challenge, change, and complexity, as I call it, the 3 C's. And yet these are the inevitable elements of what it means to be human. And then the conversation gets to be not, did it happen? Because it absolutely did. It's when, not if. It's then how do we come back from that? How do we come back around the other side? How do we stand up one more time, then we fall down? And that's really what I've always been super interested in. I mean, the stories of the 3 C's of challenge, change, and complexity, they're always, everyone's story is fascinating to me. And yet what I'm most interested in is not that you went through something hard or that a person went through something hard, because we all go through hard things. It's what do we then do after that to be able to return, to come back to ourselves and to not get lost on that journey. If we get lost out there on the dark side of the moon, that means we're not bringing the best of ourselves, the best of our humanity, our strengths, our talents, our unique skills, contributions to humanity and to this planet. And so, when I think about why am I so invested in resilience, it's not really for resilience itself, but because this is the unlock, that brings us back and that allows us to flourish, not only for ourselves, but to up level humanity.
Where did this all start for you?
Yeah. So, it started at the epicenter of my own resilience story or stories, So in my book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, I tell one of my resilience stories. One of my resilient stories is, at a high level in high school, starting at age 14, a man came to my window while I was getting dressed for school. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know who he was there. I didn't know he was there. And when I had a ground floor bedroom, and when I went over to turn off, my stereo, which for those of you that did not grow up at the time that Jay and I did, see us after for an explanation of stereo, along with VHS and butter churn. These are all things that
And
we can
beta.
tell you about
Yes.
in our childhood. I go over to turn off my music on the stereo, and there's this face at the bottom of my window. And he says, "Take off your clothes. You're beautiful." And, I'm as freaked out as I've ever been at age 14. And so I tell him, to use bad language, which I wasn't allowed to do, but it seemed like in the moment that was called for.
Yes.
And then I went and got my parents, and, I was, all freaked out. And so we call them, make a police report, and blah, blah, blah. And, the police say, okay, probably just somebody passing through the neighborhood, probably just a fluke. So time goes on, and 8-10 months later, my parents are out of town. I'm in my bedroom again, and now that window where I'd sort of seen his face at the bottom of the window, I always keep that window shut. There's another window in the back of the house that was open with just a screen, and I'd gone shopping with my girlfriends that day, and so I was trying on some of the things that I got, and as soon as I was completely naked, I heard his voice again. And he said, "I've been waiting a long time for this." And at that moment, it's not always that things change in a moment. Sometimes it's incrementally, sometimes it's gradually over time. And sometimes in life, everything changes in a split second. And that was one of those moments where, for me, everything changed, because now I'm realizing 3 things. I'm realizing, 1, that I am naked in front of a man for the first time. 2, I'm realizing this is not a fluke, as the police officer had hoped it was. And 3, there's a loss of innocence. My childhood bedroom that should have been the safest place for me became profoundly unsafe. And so at this moment, I was really jarred out of, a childhood and into adulthood. And, then this persisted, where his behavior continued to escalate. I didn't know who he was, where he was attempting to break into our house when I was home alone, when I was babysitting in the neighborhood. We had an issue with someone trying to break into that house when I was by myself. And I went off to college, and my mom called me early one morning and said that one of our neighbors had been arrested, who lived just 3 or 4 houses away, diagonally from our house across a park. You could see straight into our house, who was there, who was not there, what cars were parked, what weren't. And, he was the older son of a neighbor who was arrested for brutally raping and beating another woman in our neighborhood.
Wow.
And he ultimately went to prison for 2 decades. And I too spent 20 years in captivity because I developed post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And so, this is just, sort of one of an array of resilient stories that I have in my life. But as a young woman grappling with all of the uncertainty and fear and not understanding why this was happening and not getting the support, that I needed or wanted, that would allow this, for me to feel really protected from this person or even knowing who it was. All of those things have created a sort of indelible imprint on me. And, one of the things that we started talking about initially was this idea of resilient stories. When I wrote my book, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, I had also told that story on my TEDx, which has now been viewed 1.3 million times.
Amazing.
And in telling that story, both in a book and on the TEDx stage, many, many people have now come to me and said, I want to be able to tell my resilient story on a larger platform. I want to become a best-selling author. I want to be able to do those things. And so my team and I have developed this new project. It's called Triumphs of Transformation. It's a compilation book. Think Chicken Soup for the Soul meets Stories of Resilience, where we'll be able to leverage what I learned becoming a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller and allow people, I think it's 30 authors, to contribute their stories of resilience, to be able to share their stories with the world and to become a best-selling author in the way that I did. And the reason that this just generally is powerful, and it's also the reason that I wanted to engage in this project, even though I've never done something like this before, is what I've learned is that our ability to tap into our vulnerability, which is the first practice of highly resilient people, by the way, and our ability to tap into our authenticity and our empathy and to share our resilient stories, I believe, is the highest echelon of healing that we can engage in. Because what happens when we do this is we take the darkest things that happen to us, developing PTSD and being in my childhood bedroom and not feeling safe and not knowing when this person was going to come. That is one of the darker times in my life. And yet, and I was so ashamed for a long time. I was so ashamed of developing PTSD, of the symptoms that come with that. I hid that from friends and family and coworkers. I didn't talk about it. And then when I started talking about it, a funny thing happened. I wasn't shunned in the way that I thought I would be. I was actually accepted to a greater degree. And I had deeper relationships with people as a result of telling that story. And so I'm convinced that telling our resilient stories is the highest echelon of healing that we can engage in, because what we effectively do, Jay, is we take the darkest moments in our lives, and by finding a way to tell those stories, we actually transmute that darkness and we turn it into light. And it's light that we then shine on someone else's path, someone else's journey who's in the midst of challenge. We become part of someone else's survival guide. And that is the highest order of healing, to take our darkness and to alchemize it into light.
Yeah. I mean, first off, I've heard you tell that story, which made it easier for me to hear just now. And it's, it's absolutely jaw-dropping to put. When you tell it, I feel like I'm there and I'm scared for you. And I agree with you that the only way to really truly heal from trauma is to be able to share something in the hope that it's going to help somebody else. Or at least, for me, in that moment of losing my mother And then anytime somebody that I knew on some level was dealing with a similar situation of loss, I felt like it was my responsibility. It was the only positive thing to come out of the situation for myself, was that I could help others on some level through it. And then even something as simple as, not drinking and things of that nature. I made a post today on my Instagram, and somebody that I know responded to it and said, my father hasn't drank for the last 4 months and lost 20 pounds as a result of just watching your content on Instagram. And I was like, wow, like I'm doing it for myself as an accountability tool to just, talk to myself. But the fact that one other person can have any positive impact from it is like the most amazing thing on the planet. So I can only imagine the amount of people that are flocking to you because you can help them feel better and not feel so ashamed about things that have happened to them in their life that were out of their control.
And it's been quite a journey.
I'm
That is
sure.
for sure. And, I think one of the beautiful things about it too is just what you mentioned, which is when we release these resilient stories into the world, when we have when we tap into that first practice of the 5 practices of highly resilient people, and we allow ourselves to authentically tell our stories, what happens is we release that out into the world, and we actually don't know, all of the ways that people will positively be impacted by the way that we transformed that darkness into light in our own lives and to light our path. But we put that out into the world, and then it comes back to us in the most beautiful and exciting and delightful and unexpected ways, which is, just like you said, receiving a message from someone who said, hey, your content has impacted me or my father or someone in my life in ways that, you probably hadn't imagined just exactly how that was going to speak into someone's life. And yet now what you've done is you've taken that darkness and you've gotten to use it for good. And it's just amazing.
You said something interesting earlier. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And you had a traumatic experience at a young age. I had a traumatic experience, very different, at a slightly older age. And the concept of safety was, introduced into my life and your life for the first time, where a place that you felt completely in control and safe was no longer there for you. And when you described that, it's crazy because that's exactly how I felt. Like my childhood home, my father sold it within months of my mom passing. Anything that was familiar and comfortable for me was gone in the matter of months. And I feel like that's something that we share. But there's a lot of people, even in their 30s and 40s, who haven't experienced what you've experienced or what I've experienced, and maybe, have dealt with lesser traumatic things along the way. But do you believe that there's different levels of these types of things that people, may or may not ever experience?
Sure, absolutely. So this is a really important conversation. I'm so glad you brought this up. So let's see, how do I want to say it? Okay, so a couple of things, right? One, my fiance is big into playing poker, and even if you don't play poker, I think a lot of us are familiar with poker card games. So it's a good sort of example or illusion to use. And so, in poker, everybody gets dealt 2 cards, right? At least in Texas Hold'em, and so you've got your 2 cards, and then there's also cards that are dealt on the table in front of you, right? Which are the collective cards of all of the players. And so, I think we all have, our collective cards on the table, right? Things that, we share with other people in our lives. And then we've got 2 cards that are just ours, just our own unique experience. And some people at our table of life, if you will, based on the particular cards that are in the middle for all of us, they will have a better hand, than we do. And some people at our table of life will have a hand that is not as good as the one we got dealt. And our only responsibility in that moment is just to play the hell out of the cards that we were dealt. We can't play somebody else's hand. And so there's always going to be someone who has a tougher road than us. I mean, I only have to like turn on the news and see what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia and with Israel and Palestine and Gaza to be like, look, any kind of bad day that I'm having, like, it's not that deep. It's not that deep,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there for sure is like a whole set of tougher hands of cards over there. And then there are other people that haven't experienced things that are as traumatic or as traumatic, to them. And that's okay too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And the other important thing to say about this is it's actually not up to us to decide whose hand we think is better and whose hand we don't think is good. What was profoundly traumatic and difficult for me, I get to decide what the level of that difficulty is. We don't get to go around saying like, well, this happened to you, so that wasn't very traumatic. It's like we decide.
Yeah.
So someone could look at me, you could look at my story and say, yeah, that's rough, but he never got in, he never broke into the house, he never got at you. You were never sexually assaulted in the way that, at least 25% of women that report, are. And you would be absolutely right, And so, but what happened for me is meaningful because it's mine. That is my story and my life. And so we are entitled to feel and experience our story, regardless of whether or not we think somebody got a better or a worse shake at things. And so I think it's important that we not be in judgment of other people's stories. And also, this is important too, Jay, also that a lot of people do this. A lot of people say, well, I don't deserve to feel bad about that. I don't deserve to be upset about that because look at these people. Look at, somebody else got it so much worse than me. So we are also entitled to our own stories. We don't just get to shut that off or pretend that it didn't happen or not tap into that experience simply because we think someone else had a worse experience and we're not entitled to feel and experience what we did. So that's really important.
The poker analogy was great, and it really, again, when you speak, I'm like I was watching the movie Rounders in my head as you were telling me the story about poker.
Which character was I like KGB, like doing the Oreos slowly,
it's been too long for me to even tell you which character, but the fact that I was able to even get the name of the movie I'm impressed with myself.
I love it. I would like to pretend that I was more of Matt Damon's character than the KGB character. I'm trying to think of the actor who plays that guy.
Yeah, it was definitely more Matt Damon because he's the only person I remember from the movie, so it had to be. So, and it actually, based on what you just said, I'm curious. Are there people that come at you about your story since to your point, you weren't sexually abused and things of that nature? Like, have you actually received any negative feedback? Because it sounded like there's judgment. Yeah, I think there's judgment all the way around, right? Regardless of what we say, we're going to be judged on some level.
Yeah, I actually haven't received any judgment,
I'm happy
for
to
better,
hear that.
for worse. Like people seem to be really horrified when I tell that story. And depending on what people's experience has been in the past, it can be really triggering for them. So I actually learned before I wrote my book, I did my TEDx talk first.
Yeah.
And as I was reading through, the hundreds of comments that are there, I think I've read just about every one at this point. A small subset of people didn't know that story was coming because my TEDx talk is like, how resilience breaks us out of our vulnerability cage. So there's like nothing that prepares you for me to tell you that I'm going to tell you that creepy story from stage. And I read in the comments, a couple of people said, I've had some experiences that this triggered for me, or I wish I knew that this story was going to be in here. And so I learned from that feedback. And so when I wrote my book, I actually, right before I told the story, I said, hey, I'm going to tell a story that, is going to encapsulate, sort of loss of safety, and sort of gave people a high level and said, look, if you think this might be triggering for you, or you're just not in a place to read this today, that's okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead and skip forward to this heading on this page, and you will miss it completely. Come back when you're ready, or just not at all. And so I haven't experienced any judgment from that story, which I think just tells me how universally creepy it is for all of us. And
For
at the
sure.
same time, I've learned so much from people's feedback about how I can tell that story in a way that it meets people where they are, and that I prevent people who've had those experiences or similar experiences from being triggered in a way that they weren't ready for or they weren't expecting.
So back to the initial encounter, and then 8 to 10 months later, within that 8 or 10 months, were you like completely living in fear, not sleeping, like all the things, or did that happen? Did you convince yourself on some level, since the cops said, oh, it's no big deal, somebody's passing through, did you convince yourself that you weren't really at risk of this happening again? And then it was that much worse when he did actually come back to the house. How did you deal
Yeah,
with that? Yeah.
great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that question before. So, as an interviewer, when somebody's like, no one's ever asked me that question before, I'm always like, that's right. So, no one has ever asked me that question before. Such a good
I'm
question.
surprised, but yeah, that's like the first thing I thought of.
Go you. Yeah, it was the latter, which was in the recesses of my mind. Even at 14, I think I understood that it was possible that this was not a fluke. And yet I convinced myself until I had evidence to the contrary that it was,
Yeah.
and that's a way also that I have chosen to live my life. I think so often we worry about tremendous tragedies and losses that never actually take place. And we use so much of our mental energy. There's a quote that goes something like, I've experienced a number of tragedies in my life, most of which never happened.
Yeah. Wow.
Because we can live those things in our mind, even if they don't ever occur in reality. And so I've really chosen to live my life in a way where, as long as it's not being naive or putting myself in danger in some way, to like believe that the best possible outcome is possible, or that things could be good, or things could be safe, or things could get better. And so for me, I decided, and that's an important word.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I just slid into one way or the other. I made a conscious choice to say, I am going to believe that this is a fluke until there is additional evidence to the contrary.
Yeah.
And then 8-10 months later, when it seemed that I had additional evidence to the contrary, it was like, okay, this is really very not good.
Yeah. I feel like we have to have hope on some level, right? Like if we don't have hope, what do we have? How can you, how can you pick yourself up and go on without having hope? And I think there's also, there's been things like when things happen, negative things happen, I'm always looking at, the glass is half full. There's always a silver lining. That's just the way I'm wired. I try to see things, even the most negative thing, I try to find some sort of inkling of something positive in it. And that's also I think a coping mechanism, but to your point, you don't want to put yourself in harm's way because you're acting as if something, didn't happen, or, there's not another risk of that happening again, but you have to have hope.
Yeah. And, in fact, what you're also talking about, so we talked about the first practice of highly resilient people, which is vulnerability.
Yes.
And so I'm just going to
break
skip
them down
over.
so we can walk through them?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
okay. So real quick, the second practice is productive perseverance, which is the intelligent pursuit of a goal, knowing when to maintain the mission in the face of challenge and when to pivot in a new direction in the face of diminishing returns. The third practice is the practice of connection, which is twofold. It's the connection that we have first and foremost to ourselves, which we often forget about. We think connection, social support, outside of ourselves. And really, first and foremost, it's about cultivating that deep and abiding relationship with ourselves. And then also on how we layer on top of that the connections that we have with other people and what we do in those moments where the sort of intersectionality of the connection I have with myself and the connection I have with others might be divergent or at odds. The fourth practice is the practice of gratiosity. And so this is the practice about really sharing our resilient stories. And so it's a word that I created to encompass this practice. The gratiosity, is gratitude. It's being able to look on those challenges, even if we wouldn't have chosen them, like my stalker and PTSD and the untimely loss of your mother. Neither of us would have chosen it. And yet, to be able to have the mental fortitude to look on those moments and say, even though I wouldn't have chosen this, I can see the good in this. I can find gratitude for what I learned, how I was formed, what this has now led to, the fire that it's created within you, the way that you have shown up for people in your life and allowed people to make changes in their own lives that you perhaps would not have otherwise.
Sure. Yeah.
And then the osity part is generosity. It's the generosity of sharing our resilient stories at scale so that we can transmute that darkness into light and use that light to illuminate the path of people who are in it, who are coming up behind us in challenge, who need that hope, to your point. And then the fifth practice is the practice of possibility, which is about focusing on progress, not perfection. I remind myself of this every day. And then it's of effectively evaluating, in the practice of possibility, both the risk and the opportunity anytime we face challenge. And so that's actually what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the effective evaluation of risk and opportunity that's going to show up in our lives anytime we face challenge. The risk of, what could happen if this guy comes back, and guarding against that, and also the opportunity in that moment for me to tell myself a story that might feel better, to help, in that moment. And so, that's the beautiful part, I think, of the challenge that shows up in your life, is there's always a possibility, with challenge. And so what we get to do is we get to not over-index on risk or fear and allow that to paralyze us, and also not over-index on the opportunity, because that becomes naivete, that becomes toxic positivity. And so to really confront, what Admiral Stockdale said, if you've heard of the Stockdale paradox, he was the highest ranking member of the military that was held as a prisoner of war with John McCain during the Vietnam War. He talks about, confronting the brutal reality of today, and also not losing sight of the positive, beautiful future ahead, and the paradox of being able to hold both of those.
Sure. Profound. It's amazing. Your work's amazing. I'm so happy we had a chance to have this discussion. Where does everybody find this book?
Oh, yes. The book can be found on Amazon. I actually read it on Audible as well.
Amazing.
So if you want to hear me read the book to you, bedtime story style, or while you're out for a run or a hike or taking a long drive, it'll be just like I'm saying it to you. It's so fun. So it's called The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. I pinch myself every time I say this, just so we're clear. It's endorsed by Pinch, Ariana Huffington, Kathy Ireland, Daniel Pink, and Marshall Goldsmith, who are very prolific and luminary business authors, Keith Ferrazzi, Quentin Aaron, who was the star he played Michael Orr in the film The Blind Side.
Sure.
So I am just delighted and honored to have so many people get behind this work, to believe in it, to believe in me, to be making a change and a difference. For all of you listening, I would be honored if you bought the book. You don't need to. It's already a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller. No pressure or expectation. What I would love, I'm on Instagram as Dr. Dr. Taryn Marie. And, drop me a note, head on over to the page, send me a note in DMs. Let me know what your experience was with this episode, with this conversation. I would love to hear it. If you're interested in being part of our compilation book, we've got space for, just a couple more authors called Triumph and Transformation, you can let me know that. And it's such an honor to be here with you, Jay. You're an incredible interviewer, and I really love your show.
You're too kind. I appreciate it so much. This was such a great conversation, and I know a lot of people are going to get so much out of this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.